The Regent's Reign, Chapter 20, Different Perspectives. By the time the others caught up to him, Arthur had made it up to the top of the ridge. It had been harder to do in full armor than the girl in her light cloak. The girl had to have been the same one he'd seen jump out a window, the one who had implied that she'd been born with magic. He'd gotten a look at her this time, sort of. She had still been wearing the veil she'd worn last time he'd seen her, but it looked cleaner. All of her clothes had looked cleaner and better made. He suspected they weren't the exact same as the ones she'd worn at the Slaver's stronghold. Her hair was pale, nearly white, and her eyes had been a gleaming, burning gold, but something about them had seemed almost familiar. If he didn't know better, he would say he'd met her somewhere before. He couldn't help but wonder why she wore the mask. Perhaps she was burned? He'd met a sorcerer who'd had horrible facial scarring from a brush with the pyre. The thought of it made his stomach turn. It didn't help that Edwin had tried to kill his father, and possibly Morgana. He still wasn't sure all that had happened there. "Sire?" Elian called up to him. Arthur frowned. The girl had vanished into the last of the fog. The remains of the griffin were decaying in the small grove behind him. Lancelot was eyeing it warily. Agravain looked shaken. "How did you manage to kill it, Arthur?"
"I didn't. The druid girl did."
"Druid girl?" Agravain asked.
"The same one who jumped out a window. She had a flaming dagger,"
Arthur said, frowning as the fog ebbed away. "Flaming dagger?" Elian asked, raising an eyebrow. "Jumped out a window? What sort of deranged madwoman are we dealing with? Arthur, she could have killed you," Agravain said, stowing his blade.
"But she didn't. She has had 3 chances now to do something, anything to me, and she didn't,"
Arthur said, shaking his head as he climbed down into the clearing. It was clear now that there had been a camp here recently. There was a partially crushed tent under the remains of the griffin.
"Perhaps she simply wanted to defend her home,"
Lancelot reasoned, nodding his head towards the wrecked tent. "Foolishness! Magic cannot be trusted, Sir Lancelot," Agravain stated. Arthur shook his head.
"No, Lancelot may have a point."
Arthur cut his uncle off. Shaking his head, he turned to his knights.
"Sir Elian, gather the men. We'll check on the village and let them know that the beast has been slain. Uncle, assist him, please. Sir Lancelot, I'd like a word."
The other 2 left, albeit reluctantly, and Lancelot frowned.
"I've never asked you your opinion on magic, Sir Lancelot,"
Arthur said after a rather pregnant pause.
"No, you haven't." "You were not born in Camelot, were you?"
Arthur asked.
"No, my home was in Gawain before it was destroyed,"
Lancelot admitted.
"Gawain is no friend to magic,"
Arthur pointed out. "Nor is it an enemy," Lancelot countered. Arthur raised an eyebrow.
"Lord Godwin makes a show of upholding Uther's laws on magic, but he sends out no mass manhunts for those who practice it, as long as they do no harm." "Why is it I've never heard of this? The druids kidnapped Morgana, did they? Or perhaps there is more to that story. There are few enough who would know the answer to that now, and even fewer who would tell us." "She was injured when I found her.
Arthur stopped, cold, remembering the black veins twisting out from the wound on Morgana's ankle.
"Sire? Merlin had a similar injury.
He trailed off, shaking his head.
"I would hear more about your opinions of magic, but not here. Only in private. My uncle subscribes heavily to my father's opinions."
"Do you?" Lancelot asked.
"I don't know anymore,"
Arthur said with a shake of his head. Near 2 weeks later, and Arthur was still thinking about his answer. The griffins, for according to the townsfolk there had been 2, were dead, both slain by the druid girl, and her companions, for several of the townspeople had seen 2 other cloaked figures who had helped the girl slay the first beast, wielding magic and sword in deadly concert. Merlin, Gawain, and Percival had returned to Camelot before his party, and Arthur couldn't help but watch her leave at his chambers, eyes trained on the faint black veins that peeked innocently out from the collar of her tunic, coming from her right shoulder. Morgana had a similar scar on her left ankle, supposedly from her short-lived captivity at the hands of the Druid camp. Morgana's had been smaller, though, less pronounced. But Merlin had no real interaction with the Druids, and it had been Morgana and Morgoth's hands that Merlin had earned that scar. Poison, or so Merlin claimed. But was that what it had been? She herself admitted to remembering little of the attack. Arthur had been pleasantly surprised when he was surprised by a week-long hunting trip arranged by Merlin and his closest knights. They would not stray too far from the city, but it would be nice to get out for something other than his people being threatened. Something else occurred to him as he and his men sat around the fire. Merlin, who had tagged along, laughing at something Gawain had said. He didn't know how most of his closest knights felt about one of the most important issues in Camelot. Well, most important if one were to ask his father a few years ago. Percival had grown up in S tier. Senred's old laws had been brutal, commanding that any and all peoples in S tier with magical abilities of any sort report to the castle for proper training. Arthur had read up on what that training was meant to be. It was couched in niceties, sure, but it was tantamount to torture, meant to twist their minds and powers to his whims. Lancelot was from Gawain, who apparently nominally upheld Uther's laws, but turned a blind eye to those who did no harm. Arthur had no idea where Gawain was from originally. Merlin was something of a special case, something of a conundrum when it came to this point. Arthur knew she was from S tier, but he also knew her closest friend had been a sorcerer who had escaped Senred's cruel measures, likely because Ealdor was so small and so close to Camelot's border. But he also knew she tended to run from magical threats. Though, no, that wasn't really true at all. She had faced the Avank with him. She had sought out the sorcerer Anhora when Arthur failed his test and Camelot was to be doomed to die after he killed the unicorn.
"What do you think of magic?"
he asked when it was just him and Gawain sitting next to the fire. Gawain spit ale across the fire, making the flames spark and sizzle. "What?" he asked, wiping his chin.
"You didn't grow up in Camelot."
"No, I didn't. I grew up in Carlion," Gawain admitted, looking wary. "Why ask this out of the blue, princess?"
He sighed. "I am beginning to wonder if my father
is a bigoted, hateful old man. Because if that's the conclusion you have drawn, then may I congratulate you on being the last to know," Gawain said, holding out the skin of ale. Arthur took it and took a long drag.
"All I have ever seen magic used for is evil,"
Arthur admitted. "Well, who's gonna do anything moderately helpful when your father will make them a head shorter for it?" Gawain asked, taking the skin back and taking another swig before passing it back to Arthur. "Look at it this way. Evil can be done with a sword as easily as good. Why would something like magic be different? It's not what it is that's evil. It's how it's used that counts." Arthur was silent for a moment, so Gawain continued. "Separate it from fighting, even. A physician can heal someone with a mix of herbs, right? But if they add or take away one thing, the same medicine becomes poison. That's knowledge as a weapon. Would you have all learning outlawed because some of it can be dangerous in the wrong hands?" Arthur took another swig.
"You're dodging the question."
"I don't give a toss about magic. I give a toss about who's using it and how. And maybe the why, depending on the situation, Gawain said with a shrug.
Maybe you need to start learning about it. Can't really decide if you hate a thing when you know nothing about it.
Not without making an ass of yourself, anyway, he pointed out, gesturing at Arthur with the skin.